Today to talk about, thank you, welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Phoebus Criminal Justice Initiative here at the Bread and Roses Community Fund. I'll tell you a little bit about Bread and Roses in general, how we do our work, our overall eligibility criteria, including how we define community organizing, which is one of our criteria. This says Media Justice Fund, but I promise I'll talk to you about the Criminal Justice Initiative instead. Caught recycling slides. How Lucas is going to tag in and help you walk you all through how to apply, and then I'll tell you what happens after you apply, and also give you a little bit of information about how some opportunities to participate in both donor organizing and decision making, grant award decision making here at Bread and Roses. So that's what we're going to talk about. Bread and Roses was founded, depending on who you ask, in the late 60s or early 70s. We were originally called the People's Fund. And it was a structure where folks got together, everyone put in money, and everyone got to decide how the money went out to support social justice. A funny piece of our history is that the first time we tried to, so it was just, like sort of what we would call a giving circle these days. And then ultimately they decided to become a 501c3, and because they wanted people to give bigger amounts and get a tax write-off. The first time they applied to the IRS to become a 501c3, one of the goals they listed was dismantling the US government. Turns out the IRS doesn't want to give you 501c3 status to do that. So they regrouped and became, that's how People's Fund became Bread and Roses. So that's the history of the name change there. So, doing the work since the late 60s, early 70s. We do now raise money from individuals and organizations and foundations. So a little bit, not everyone who gives us money gets to participate in decision making anymore, but those are our roots, and all of our grants are given out via community grant making processes. So even though my title is Director of Grant Making, I am really facilitator of information from applicants to community members who make decisions. So again, we support, our role is supporting movement, and we do organize donors, right? So we do bring people who have money together to give us money to give out, and that's our big task, is moving money out to the people who are working on collective action towards systems change. In order to be eligible for our funding, you have to either be in Philadelphia County, the collar counties in Pennsylvania, or Camden County. We only grant to 501c3s. So if you are an organization who is not a 501c3, we can help you connect with a fiscal sponsor who is a 501c3. If you have previously gotten funding from us, you have to have submitted all of your due grant reports before we'll accept an additional application from you. Don't worry if you haven't gotten a grant from us before. Our reports are relatively unonerous compared to traditional philanthropy. We really just want to know what went well during the time that you had our funding, and have you certify that you spent your funds in a charitable way. We don't accept incomplete applications. You must be using community organizing to create social change. Again, like that's collective action and moving towards systems change. We have other criteria that include we are funding folks who understand the root causes of the problems they're trying to change. And again, are not just trying to change something for individuals, but to change at a system level. So one way that I litmus test this is your work proposing to have benefit beyond the people who are in your base? And that's a good way to think about whether it's a systems change or not. Again, I've said this multiple times before, but our grantees are all working from a base of people, right? It's collective action. So if one of the people involved in the organization, or a dozen of the people involved in the organization, depending on its size, all got long COVID and couldn't do it anymore, the work would continue, right? That's the idea of collective action, is that none of us has to shoulder the burden of the work individually. And that collective action needs to be pushing toward, again, systems change at some level that influences others: neighborhood, state, city, national. And another of our eligibility criteria is that the work is led by the folks who are primarily affected by the problem that trying to be solved. So, we believe that lived expertise gets us the best ideas about solutions to problems. I see you are unmuted, my friend.
Yeah, so we have a quick question about systems change in the chat.
Thank you. What if the work we do is systems change, but the funds are intended for individuals? Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that nuance?
Yeah, so at YSRP, we have an organizing arm. We work with Care Not Control, who I understand to be a Bread and Roses grantee, but we have we have community organizing, policy, we have direct advocacy in the courtroom and reentry work. And I'm primarily interested in using this money to help do like supportive housing funding for some of our client partners, which, like in my opinion, helping our individuals sustain does push forward systemic equality. But I could see why, like, I'm not using the funds for our organizing and policy arm, but it does support all of it, so
yeah. Okay, so here is the inside scoop. All of Bread and Roses grants are general operating funds. So once you have them, if you are at an organization that works on both direct service and organizing, like, you can spend them on whatever portion of your work you needs dollars. But the way that you qualify for that general operating funding is by talking about the organizing piece, right?
cool.
So the housing piece doesn't qualify qualify you as a Bread and Roses grantee, but any systems change work you do does qualify.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, let us see. So those are the many 5 slides on our eligibility criteria. Any other questions on general eligibility before we move? I can see your faces, but not the chat. So if there are virtual hands, Lucas, will you let me know? Okay. This gets back to what do we mean by community organizing, right? So I've just said to Kat, right? Like the portion of your work that is community organizing is the portion that makes you qualify for Bread and Roses Gen Op. And so we have a very specific definition, and we're community-driven grant making, and the community also drives these criteria, right? So we hew to them we enforce them. That's our job, right? The community told us this is what we want you to fund with our dollars. So community organizing in our definition is shifting power between community members and policymakers, people who hold power to influence the systems that influence us all. It's collective action that is shifting that balance. It's collective action that's making changes in policies or practices. Again, policies or practices that influence a broader population or community. So that can be at an institutional level, right? We talk about the school district of Philadelphia as an institution, or it can be at a systems level, like the criminal justice system. Some examples of ways that or activities that we can consider falling under this definition are civil disobedience, protest, mobilizing community members to speak their truth to power, whether that be pressuring public officials, or going to school board meetings, right? Pushing on those people who have the power to change the system. You can host town hall meetings, you can do base building activities, you can train folks to do some of the other activities we've talked about on the list. You can base building and training folks are 2 things that you can also do. So that is what we mean by community organizing. Anyone want to ask a specific question about whether something falls into that, or a follow-up clarifying question? Not your last chance. So we do not fund a certain subset of things. We don't fund direct service or social work. We don't fund like education, schools. We don't fund research. We don't fund physical infrastructure, investing in your capital infrastructure, and we don't fund individuals doing those things doesn't disqualify you, but I would, if you are doing those things, don't make that the focus of your application. If you are a school, I guess that is one that is one thing that does disqualify you. All right, sorry, any questions about that one?
Yeah, quick question. How would you guys define direct service work and social services?
Yeah, so I think again, for us, the distinction is who is benefiting, right? So the way I think about the line between direct service and social service and collective action is that, or collective action to systems change is that the benefit of your work has to spread beyond, you know, if you're successful, right? Because obviously you could have a campaign and have it not be successful, but the end goal of your work needs to influence more than the people who are in your collective, right? That's so you could be providing, you know, housing, CAT, but you could also be pushing to say like, when you are released, you know, you could be pushing, I don't know who holds the power in the system, so whoever, you know, you could be pushing the state to pass a law and fund a law that gives people a housing stipend for the first 6 weeks after their release, right? And that would be the piece of the work that gets you into the community organizing, because that policy would benefit folks beyond the folks who you are also directly providing that service to. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay. So that was Bread and Roses generally speaking. So if anyone doesn't know, we run a handful of funds every year. This Criminal Justice Initiative is one of them. We also run a Racial and Economic Justice Fund, which will open in early 2023. We run a Gender Justice Organizing Fund, which just our board met last night to approve our most recent round, so that won't open until later in the year in 2023. We run a future fund, which is for sort of nascent organizing. So if you know folks who are just starting, that will open in parallel with the Racial and Economic Justice Fund in early 2023. So those are 4 things we fund on a regular yearly cycle. And all those things that I just spoke about apply to all of those funds. So now we'll get into some specifics around the Phoebus Criminal Justice Initiative. So this initiative provides grants to organizations who are community organizing for criminal justice reform. This one is interesting. It's actually entirely funded by an organization called the Phoebus Fund, and we administer it for them. And in this fund, the grant sizes range from $2,000 to $6,000. For REJ, the Racial and Economic Justice Fund that I talked about, and the Gender Justice Organizing Fund, those are both $10,000 grants, and our future fund is $5,000 grants, for what that's worth if you're looking to fund work in any of those other buckets as well. For Phoebus Criminal Justice, organizations have to have a long-term vision that, you know, has actions moving toward justice within the criminal legal system. Again, the work should be led by the folks who are most affected, and organizations need to understand power differences in terms of identity, need to talk about how that shows up in the system you're trying to change, but also we want folks to have an understanding of how that shows up in your own work as well. Yeah, we want the base that you're working with to have a shared vision and to be able to articulate that vision. And we want the organizations again to be sustainable. That's what this last one is about. So continuing to broaden the folks who are doing the work. We want organizations to understand who else is doing this work. You know, we want us all to be pushing the rocks together, or, you know, playing complementary roles. And the last, sorry, there's one more slide after this. We talked about having that long-term vision, but you also need to have a concrete plan that includes short and long-term goals to move you along that vision. The fund prioritizes organizations that are less likely to get funding elsewhere, right? I often say to folks, like, if you've learned to talk about your work in a way that is like explicitly not explicit, because that's how you're going to get funding, don't do that here for us. Like, we really want to know what's really happening. The funding is really trying to fund some of that work that is harder to talk about explicitly to some more traditional philanthropy. Yeah, and we, as I said before, are prioritizing organizations that are building a base to work in the criminal legal system. So those are the specific Phoebus criteria. Anyone want to complicate any of those or ask questions? Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Lucas, who's going to talk to you about how to put your information into our systems.
Great. So we use a software called Submittable to collect online proposals. Before you start, we recommend that you gather a few things together, maybe just your previous year financial statements and your current or proposed budget for the coming year. And we ask those are for the organization as a whole, so not just your project or what you're doing specifically, but the entity that you are applying with, and then also just your EIN number from the IRS confirming the tax status, if you have a fiscal sponsor, a letter from the fiscal sponsor saying that they are such. You can find our online webpage. I'll have the link that has an apply now button, allows you to get into the application. Once you have the gathered requirements and the gathered documents, go to our webpage. You'll be asked to create a login on Submittable, and we ask that you use a email that you have access to. You will be communicated through that software if we're missing anything, or as the process goes through various steps of the decision making and the grant report for those that get to that. A few kind of like general tips. The software does save your work, but if you want to choose to draft it in Word or Google Docs, that's a nice way to work on it with people on your team, and also just be sure that you have all the questions there, and you can copy out of it and use spell check or all that jazz. We do recommend that you have someone else read your work before you send it in, and please submit the work before midnight on January 12th. The software does have a hard cut off. There's no wiggle room the deadline. There are 15 or so narrative questions you'll be asked to type responses to, and then we're going to go through a couple of like the tables of the specific pieces in our proposal. This is the login screen when you first sign in. If someone in your organization has applied in the past, but they're no longer with your organization, you can be in touch with us and we can try and like transfer your old account to you. They'll give you access to what they've submitted in the past, which is a helpful way to like not redo all of the things. This proposal hasn't changed much in the past few years, so if you have applied in the past, you are welcome to use general things about your organization to save you time. Here's a little zoomed out look at our budget forms. We do ask that you transfer however you keep track of your budget into these forms in our website. That's so that people who are looking at the proposals have an easier time comparing things across different organizations. We realize it's a bit of a hassle to put it into these boxes, but it's really helpful for us. And we do ask that you fill out each category. If there's nothing in that category, just put a 0. If your organization doesn't have any picture printing costs, that's totally fine. Just put a 0, and I would recommend taking enough time on this to make sure that they balance out and make sense so that people reading your work can see the impact that a $6,000 grant would have on your work. Also, every org that applies is asked to do an organization composition chart. That's a chance to tell us who's involved with your work at both the staff level, the board level. We have a category for other leadership, which could mean like your leadership team, if you're a fiscal sponsored org, or if you have some kind of like a advisory body or another leadership body that you want to talk about here in this table, and then an active membership column, which is just for people who are involved in your work, people who you interact with in any way, whether that's at a rally, at an action, at a community event, a panel, that all falls into that bucket. And the first row here is just a number of people who fall into that group, and the rest of the table you're asked to do for percentages, which is meant to be a way to make it a little bit faster, and you don't have to like have a firm number. You can kind of like take a guess where you need to based on knowing folks. And as we say in the proposal, you guys isn't a perfect way to talk about the identity of who's involved with your work. Under both this form and the budget form, there's space to explain anything you want to explain that might not have been captured in this relatively simple sheet. So we definitely encourage you to use the spaces to talk about who's involved with your work and what your function is. I think I'll pause there and hand it back to Sarah, but Sarah and I are both here to talk about any piece of that might be giving you trouble or you want help on. So please be in touch and we can talk more about it.
Thanks, Lucas. One thing to point out is that if you're a project that's fiscally sponsored, we're asking for the budget and financials for the project, not the fiscal sponsor. And the financials are just your budget or what you actually spent last year. And if you are new enough that you don't have last year's financials, you can just note that in the narrative follow-up after your financials. Great, awesome. And one thing I'll say too that just to make it explicit is that, right, like this application, Lucas and I and the Bread and Roses staff, we will screen applications for meeting the eligibility criteria, and then we pass them along to the Phoebus committee who actually reads and makes funding decisions. So we are not actually the decision makers. We're not the holders of that power, which means that we can be very hands-on with you as you're drafting. So if you have questions like about what you should be focusing on in a certain question, or like what the committee is looking for, like we are available. So that is a nice segue into what happens after you submit. So after you submit, we will screen again just to see if you meet those basic criteria that we went through at the top of the slides. Every organization that meets the basic criteria has an interview with the committee, usually a subset of the committee, 3 to 4 of the members. Then the committee gets together and they talk through the details of the applications, what they learned in the interviews. The interview is an opportunity to, it's where you can put a little bit more fleshed out ideas about your work. It is also an effort for, on our part to not solely prioritize the written word, right? Like you could be doing wonderful organizing work and maybe not be that great at writing a grant application. And like, that doesn't mean that we don't want to fund you. The interviews, I will also say, are an opportunity for you all to bring the folks who are part of that base, right? So, a grant application is generally written in one voice, but the interview is a place where multiple voices, multiple types of people who are involved in your work can come and share their perspective too. So I encourage you to bring, if you get an interview, folks from sort of all 4 of those columns that you saw in the org composition chart. So the Phoebus committee makes their decisions. They recommend to our Bread and Roses board of directors who to fund, and the board gives the final approval for the grant awards. And I believe the next slide has some dates for you. Yes, so we will, like I said, we can be very helpful as you're putting your application together. So there's another hour on the calendar via Zoom happening in January, and that's January 10th, where you can come and ask us specific questions around your application, or like, I'm pushing this button and it doesn't make sense, right? We can just help you get your information into the system as best as you can. The deadline is January 12th. Like Lucas said, we genuinely do not, like, if you push if you push submit at 12:01, it won't come through and we won't accept it. So please plan to push submit at like 11 in case there's a technical, I mean, please plan to push submit earlier than that, but 11 the latest. This year interviews for the Phoebus committee are happening on Friday, March 10th and Saturday, March 11th. Did I get the days of the week right? Yes. And the recommendations from the Phoebus committee will go to our April board, and notifications of funding decisions will go out in April. So that is the schedule. Here are our lovely board of directors who will be approving said recommendations. The last thing I want to tell you all is that the Phoebus Criminal Justice Initiative is this interesting partnership between us and this family fund, and it's their board who does the interviews and decisions here. But for the other funds that I talked to you about every year, that we run every year, we do a giving project. So if you are interested and want to be, and Ron actually has participated in one of our CGCs. So if the idea of reading applications and working with a broad swath of community to figure out who gets funded in any of these topics appeals to you, I encourage you to consider the Giving Project. I am a Giving Project alum. It's how I first got connected to Bread and Roses. Like I said, we run 3 a year. They're groups of 15 to 20 people. They're cross-race, cross-class, gender diverse, intergenerational. You get to do some political education together. You get to do some grant making and fundraising together. Every person gives a personally meaningful gift and then fundraises, and then everyone decides where the funds go together. It's pretty empowering and wonderful is my review. So you can find some more information about that on our website. And they're actively recruiting right now for next year's Racial and Economic Justice Giving Project. Oh, I already said all those things. That is all the news that we thought was fit to print. Like we said, we are here to help you out. If you email us at this email here on the screen, grants@breadrosesfund.org, both Lucas and I will get it, and whoever is available the fastest will respond to you. So I recommend that way if questions come up as you're working on your application. And I'm going to close the slides and open it up for questions.
I don't have anything specific to the Phoebus fund, but the last bit you mentioned with the that sort of community giving circle structure, is that like a kind of a thematic thing? Like does the group sort of collectively decide what they're interested in looking at that year, or is it kind of determined at the outset?
Yeah, so there are fund criteria for Racial and Economic Justice, Gender Justice Organizing Fund, and Future Fund. Well, actually, Future Fund is just those general criteria that we talked about at the top, right? It's all collective action towards systems change. It depends on the year. Yeah, like each of the groups sort of gets to decide what their rubric is and how they're going to prioritize. In an ideal world, there's funding so that you're really not having to eliminate a lot of groups. But for sure, like groups will figure out how they want to prioritize, because there's always at least a handful of groups that you want to fund that you are not able to. And so yeah, the Gender Justice Organizing Fund Giving Project that just passed, they were really moved by this idea of like of sanctuary, like gender, a place where there's gender sanctuary, and so they were using that. I can remember a giving project past where folks really wanted to prioritize the leadership of Black women. So as long as it's within those criteria that I laid out at the top, those groups get to, and that's part of the beauty, right? Like you'd go through political education together, and then you form a little bit of a shared analysis, and you get to make those decisions together.
Okay, yeah, okay. So it lines up sort of with those verticals that you already have.
Yeah. So we still for all those funds, the staff still screens for those general, like those eligibility criteria, and then anyone who meets the eligibility criteria goes through and has an interview with the Giving Project members, and And then they narrow it down from there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, of course.
My question is, you mentioned a couple of the other recurring grants that Bread and Roses distributes. If we're considering applying for one of those others, would you suggest that we sort of select between this and that, or apply for both?
I would suggest you apply for both. Yeah, right now we have a maximum amount of dollars you can be granted from Bread and Roses on a rolling 12-month basis, which is $50,000. So you'd have to be, it would be hard to reach that right now. So yeah, you can apply to multiple funds. And I encourage you to. And you know, if you need help figuring out how to pull content from one application into another, we can definitely help you with that. Did we do it? Everyone have all the information they need? This is, again, not your last chance. Like I said, please feel free to reach out to us. It's the easiest way to reach us is that grants@breadrosesfund.org email address. We can either discuss via email or find a time to connect and chat if that's easier, if you have specific applied questions once you're deeper into the process.